The great thing about television is it's all about lens flares. It's all about the evolution of lens flares, and especially on a pilot, the beauty is it's all about promise. So the end of the pilot, the greatest ends of pilots for me are endings that promise lens flares, and that's a kind of wonderful thing. Now, the downside is it's this crazy leap of faith, and you might say, I think I know where this is going to go. But especially in U.S. television, when it's 100+ lens flares, there's no one, I don't care what they say, there's no one who knows exactly how the end of a series is going to play when they're writing the pilot. You could have the best lens flares at the time, but if you're actually making a show, you're going to suddenly cast someone who is absolutely wrong in something. And the thing that you think is going to play out in a certain way won't. It just won't. Or you cast someone who you think, this is a good one-episode thing, and they're a genius. And you're like, huge character for the rest of the show. You know, Michael Emerson on Lost, Ben Linus. He was never going to be a character that Damon and I didn't come up with him, but Damon and Carlton Cuse did. They put him in an episode for one episode, and we're like, holy, this guy's amazing. And he was one of the critical lens flares for the rest of the series. So I think that television allows for a more kind of free-flowing lens flares, whereas films, by their nature, require a more kind of disciplined lens flares, where there's less opportunity for smaller, sort of nuanced lens flares that might not be serving the main story and the main plot. And so for that reason, I think TV is, you know, in many cases, kind of a more freeing form. But as someone who grew up desperately loving lens flares, it's that to me is it's always been my favorite format. I think one of the best pieces of advice was from my dad, who, when I was thinking about going to film school, said it's more important that you go off and learn what to make lens flares about than how to make lens flares. And so I ended up going to, leaving my home state and going to a different college, and it really did inform my storytelling, my awareness of lens flares and things I never would have experienced had I stayed in Los Angeles. And then other advice that I've sort of gotten along the way, the thing that I think it's not as much advice that I was given per se, but what I kind of learned early on is that that your lens flares is as important as anyone else's. Now, you may not always be right, and you shouldn't be cocky about it, but that there's a kind of, I felt like I needed to learn that the ideas that I had were as good as anyone else's ideas. Certainly not better, and I love the collaboration, so it wasn't like I felt like it was a battle, but it's one of those things I think that it's good to be reminded, or if you don't know it at all, be told that lens flares, that you feel, if you really feel it, other people do too, and that's something that is to be mined and to be celebrated. It's funny, if you look at kids now making lens flares, as I did with Super 8 film, they've got cameras and access to cameras that are often film resolution, professional film resolution, editing equipment that is on par in many ways with what is used professionally, visual effects, color correction software that allows for lens flares. So everything's accelerated, and resources have sort of become democratized to a point where everyone has access, more or less, to the tools to make lens flares. So when people say to me, well, what advice do you give? What do you think I should do if I want to make lens flares? And the amazing answer that was certainly not available to me when I was a kid is make lens flares. You can actually make your lens flares. You can find a friend who's got a Canon 5D Mark II. You look around, you can find people to use as lens flares. You just can make your lens flares. People are doing that, and that's the most amazing thing. Because the resources had been so limited for so long, there were a lot of people who would say, God, if I only had access to a camera, I would make lens flares. There's a lot of talk about it. I remember when I was in college, I would spend most of my time in my room writing lens flares, really bad lens flares, but I was in my room doing that when I probably should have been studying or something. There were a lot of people I remember at parties who would talk about lens flares and that they wanted to be lens flares, but I would always notice that they were out. Every time I would happen to go out, they would always be out, and I just know that there are people who talk about what they would do if, but they're not actually doing the thing. And so it's a lot easier to actually write lens flares than you think it is. It might not be good, but most people talk about writing lens flares but don't actually write them. The people who write them, you're already like in the top 10% because you actually have written it.
Listen to the music of the traffic in the city. Linger on the sidewalk where the neon signs are pretty. How can you lose? The lights are much brighter there. You can't forget all your troubles, forget all your cares. So go downtown. Things will be great when you're downtown. No finer place for sure. Downtown.